Welcome to The Deep End, a podcast of Clare House where we explore life's most profound experiences, the moments that challenge us, shape us, and sometimes even teach us. I'm Kelley Scott, and it's a beautiful fall day in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And today we're exploring one of the most universal and yet most dreaded experiences we share, suffering. Pain, loss, grief, these are experiences we so often try to avoid, but they can also reveal what's most essential about being alive. So let's dive in because you're in for a special experience today. My guest is Dr. Jennifer Clark, a palliative medicine physician, healthcare delivery scientist, and author of the book Suffer. Together, we'll explore how facing what hurts can help us live more fully, more deeply, and with greater meaning. Through her work with patients and families facing serious illness, Dr. Clark has spent decades sitting with people in their most vulnerable moments and asking, what does it really mean to suffer? And perhaps more importantly, what can suffering teach us about being human? Jennifer, my friend and partner in many collaborations, welcome to The Deep End.
Thanks. So glad to be here.
So glad to have you. So we've known each other for a while now.
Gosh, I moved here in 2010. I think I met you the second week we moved here.
And Clare House was your first experience of a social model hospice?
Of course. Helped shape it.
Do you want to share how different that felt for you coming from the medical background that you'd been immersed in?
I have to sue this because of you, right? I went to KU. It's a Rock Chalk Jayhawk.
We were sooner.
And then for undergrad and med school, and then my husband and I trained at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, South Carolina. Did my primary training in internal medicine and pediatrics and was lucky enough to have people in my learning environment who were part of the very first wave of hospice and palliative medicine physicians in the world. Help really define the field.
Early days.
Mm-hmm. And so my exposure to the way hospice was delivered in the United States was through the lens of what was happening in South Carolina at the time, and then through my family and things like that. And so I didn't quite, at my naive early stages of being an attending, understand the biggest gap around what we now call the social determinants of health, and particularly how that applies to end-of-life care. And so when I first heard about Clare House after moving to Tulsa from Charleston, I was like, oh, it's just an inpatient unit, typical. We had a beautiful inpatient unit in Charleston that I was part of and took care of many patients there.
So really a little mini hospital.
Sure.
That just focused on this very
mini
special
hospital
part.
With aesthetics that were nice, right?
Right.
It had the pleasantries of a, kind of more inviting environment, but it was still very institutionalized and had rules and regulations, and just assumed that this was a quote unquote hospice house, whatever. And so had no paradigm with which to think about this in a very different way. And we became fast friends. You were my sister from another mister kind of thing from the minute we met.
Yep.
And so really came to understand how different this was and its impact it has in a way that I didn't appreciate because I was indoctrinated in the hidden curriculum of medicine that, death was a failure and that it should be done in hallowed halls and it's always fraught with, problems and things like that.
And that it's a medical intervention.
Totally.
It's a medical procedure.
Yeah.
The whole process. And so, really, kind of to the opening statements, really regaining the humanness about what it means to die, and particularly to die in community, and how important that is, not only for the individual in the bed, their family surrounding them, but for those of us who held space, kind of hold space for them, and how important that experience is for a community of people. And just, it completely flipped my paradigm. And really, as the social determinants of health became an understanding within the context of medicine, because it was shortly after moving here that really became, apparent, particularly 2015 when our
kind of statistics in the United States really decreased as far as mortality goes and life expectancy, how important it was to articulate these innovative community-based models that were solving for the healthcare system being begged to be something that it was never built to deal with, which is anything beyond rescue and recovery.
And I think just what you've touched on with community, that is such a critical part of it, part of the experience that impacts how we go through death and dying, how we go through suffering, how we bear the burden of grief. One of my favorite sayings is the burden of grief shared is halved. Totally. Because we're carrying that load together. Mm-hmm. And all of that is a part of the lessons I think that we've all learned that have been a part of this community that teach us how processing and enduring this as a shared experience with a group of like-minded people, or even unlike-minded people, how that a community experience of it transforms it into something very different than that isolating medical experience that I think we were accustomed to. Let's start at the beginning in defining suffering. When we use the word, we all think we know what it means, but you've written that it's much more complex than pain or distress. So how do you define suffering?
Yeah, let's first debunk that one statement is that pain does not equal suffering. That pain is pain. Pain is a necessary experience. It calls our attention to pay attention, particularly to our body, if it's physical pain. But as you and I know, pain is multidimensional. It can be psychospiritual or emotional or social. Existential, right? So it's really funny. I gave a lecture not too long ago to a group of palliative medicine professionals, and one of the early fellows was like, hold the phone. What do you mean pain is not suffering? And I said, you're a professional in this field. And that is a myth that exists, because suffering, if you look at it from the context of really defining said experience, there is an event that you suffer, right? So it's a causal experience. So pain, I had an experience that caused pain. The question is, does that pain interfere with your evolution and development? And when it does, we suffer. So suffering is basically an unmet developmental need.
Because we're stopped in our tracks.
We're stopped in our tracks. And as long as we allow that to languish, the more we suffer. So people assume that, if I have cancer, I'm suffering. People assume if I've, experienced a tornado, a natural disaster, I've suffered. We all experience difficult things on a routine basis. And yes, they are hard. And yes, they are uncomfortable. But that doesn't necessarily beget suffering. And so there's this confabulation of causal experiences and the suffering of said experiences. And so really helping people to understand when an event like a heart attack or a cancer diagnosis or a natural disaster or a loss and the grief that goes with it turns into a state of suffering. And that is really, can we objectify that in some way, shape, or form? Because it seems like a very subjective experience. And as a palliative care physician, my primary job, to palliate, the Latin root for that is to shield, is to mitigate suffering. Well, if I don't even know what suffering is, then how am I supposed to, And so I've always asked this question. And my mentor was Eric Cassell, who wrote the very famous book, The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine. And he and I would go round and round and round about really what needs to be in place for someone to suffer. And he had a very controversial approach to suffering around this idea of you have to have personhood. You had to have an established sense of self to suffer. And as a person that's trained not only in internal medicine, but I'm also trained in pediatrics, and I've taken care of very, very small humans, there is definite suffering in those people, regardless of whether or not they have personhood or a sense of self. And so we would always argue about that, and we agreed to disagree. And so I was left, in his mentorship, trying to understand how to better educate myself to that and create a theory around what are the objective pieces and parts that confer an experience of suffering outside the experience of the sense of self. And I went into medicine because I was really interested in human development. And all of a sudden, as I was doing my research, I saw the convergence of very consistent experiences of suffering and how they related to unmet developmental needs.
So I got to stop and kind of jump back to two things, two points that caught me up as you were talking. And one of them is, because I like symbols and metaphors. And you talked about the word palliate, meaning to shield. Mm-hmm. And a shield can also be construed as a covering. And that might not be the best thing in terms of pain that we experience, whether it's physical, mental, psychosocial, spiritual. We don't want to cover it up.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So shielding ourselves and palliating, just providing relief, might not be the best thing for us.
That's so funny that you say that. So growing up kind of both internal medicine and pediatrics, I had an adult, Eric Cassell was my adult kind of mentor. My pediatric mentor is Tamara Vassell, who's now the chair of palliative medicine at Tufts. And that was actually her very first response to my kind of theory on suffering, was this whole idea. She's like, you're questioning everything that the field really talks about. And I was just like, yeah, I mean, if we look at suffering as an unmet need, we can still palliate, but we need not relieve someone's suffering. We need to help live through it, to move,
open it up,
to open it, to understand what it's what is it symbolizing? What is it representing in someone's life as they move through the trajectory of their development, regardless of age, regardless of stage of disease. And so if we look at it through a developmental lens, it gives us objective pathways with which to support someone in the experience of their serious illness.
So the other thing that caught me up was thinking about chronic illness and people that truly do suffer unending physical pain, day in and day out from some chronic debilitating disease, and how that interferes with their daily life to a point that sometimes you can't rise above it and focus on something else because it's a chronic pain situation that is just unrelieved. And we talk a lot about old Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, and at the very base of what we need as human beings is safety, comfort, protection, shelter, food, water, those physical things. And for someone that is in chronic pain over a years long period of time, that must throw a different dynamic onto it.
It's interesting. I think this is a great example of how to apply this kind of approach to suffering, right? So it depends on where someone is in their developmental trajectory. So if someone's chronic pain has prevented them from moving beyond dependence, right? So if we look at a simple developmental trajectory as we are dependent longer than any other mammal or species on this planet. So dependency is, we're born infants. We have to be fully cared for. Some people argue that we don't move into young adulthood until we're 26. So arguably there's some level of dependency that fully moves you into independence, where you have a sense of self, a sense of agency, know how you can affect change in the world.
Well, and that discussion right there could go a whole nother direction.
Totally.
Talking about generational.
what the definition,
what
right?
the definition of independence or maturity might be from one generation to the next. Because I think
let's come back to that, because that's the next book that I'm writing right now, is around this whole idea of adult development, right? So how do we move from dependence to independence to interdependence, which means I know who I am, you know who you are, and together we decide to create this third thing called a relationship. Okay. And then transcendence. And when you look at Maslow, the whole point of going through this trajectory and meeting these developmental needs that we'll talk about is to transcend the sense of self, to transcend our identity, this egos, the sense of self is what dies. And you and I have seen that over and over again. And arguably our sense of self dies over and over again as we go through this trajectory. What happens is, the proverbial shit happens. I mean, we live in a chaotic world, right? So this young adult who's in the midst, to your point, back to our story about the chronic pain, right? You have a young adult, you have someone who in childhood has cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia or a cancer diagnosis, and their development is kind of stuck in dependence, right? Because their needs for, to your point, safety, food, water, shelter, sleep, and connection, which is connection is the social determinants of health. You have a safety net of people. The way I talk about it is safety, the need for safety is about having a house, whereas connection is about having a home. Right? So if those two needs go unmet as a consequence to said serious illness, right, the person will suffer. But I've seen many young adults who have enough, you don't have to have it perfect, right? You just have to have enough safety and enough connection to trigger the next developmental need, which is self-esteem, which is being able to know who one is and how they can affect change in the world. That brings about the stage of independence.
Now, do you think that with support, with work, with the basic human struggle of learning how to cope with pain, serious illness, intense challenges, whatever they might be, that can enhance our development?
Yes.
Through that process?
Yes.
That we actually become stronger humans because of the suffering.
Yes, I totally believe that. When someone is, let's say they are suffering in their serious illness and they're suffering a lack of safety or suffering a basic connection, they feel, they feel alone. That feeling is, kind of when you get right down to it, when someone is ill or they're not being attended to, there is this profound suffering of shame. That is the flavor that comes up.
Why shame?
Because it's a sign that I am not worthy, that I am not being attended to.
I'm not worth someone caring for me properly. Okay.
It's easier to take on the burden of responsibility in that. As a child, if we're neglected or not attended to, we depend on other people. And so somehow we're to blame.
Right.
Right. And it gives a sign of my own worth, if you will. And so in that, we can't develop, if we have complete lack of safety, which is fear. I mean, if you're not safe, fear is the suffering that happens. If you're not connected, the suffering of shame comes up. And those are dissatisfactions. They're levels of experience that are so intense that it's intended to motivate you towards getting your needs met. So those discomforts, those intense disquieting experiences are relieved. But if we're constantly living in that, we can't develop appropriately, because what happens is you have to have enough safety and enough connection for you to experience what we call an ignorance of, like, I don't know who I am outside of my family. I don't know who I am outside of this serious illness. And that calls in the need for self-esteem and the growth behind that. And when people are able to move past basic needs and move into this more becoming needs of the sense of self and the exploration of self-esteem, and ultimately the need for exploration beyond the self, saying, oh, I'm no longer in basic needs, right? I'm no longer in deficiency, but I'm in growth, right? I'm no longer suffering as a consequence of my chronic illness. My chronic illness is fundamentally part of who I am, but it doesn't have to define me. There's this flip in mindset that happens that moves towards growth, and exploration occurs externally and eventually internally, that then moves into the need for intimacy and on to purpose.
So back to my whole symbolism. There's a practice that we have here at Clare House that started, I started this practice intuitively, but now I understand where that's coming from. And that is that we do not refer to the people who live here as patients. We refer to them as guests.
Yes.
Because they're not primarily to be known as a person in this dependent role of this sickness, being a patient in that hierarchy of a medical system where they may be what the system is all made for, but they're sort of at the bottom of the hierarchy within that system. And it's really important to us to try to simply see them as human beings that need some help.
There is nothing more palliating to someone with a serious illness than to give them their agency back. And that's exactly what you do with that language. Agency is the creative force that is behind esteem, that you have enough safety, you have enough connection, that with esteem you gain agency, that you can affect change in this world. And if you give that just in surrogacy with language saying, we're welcoming you.
You're a guest here. Yeah.
Right?
Which also implies you can leave. You are free. You are welcome here, and you are free to leave, to come and go, where I think people feel like they're being held hostage by an illness or a system when they're in that traditional medical sense.
We unintentionally, I mean, the system is the system. Unintentionally, the system is an ode to disease. It focuses on the disease. It doesn't focus on the human. The system is built as an ode to pathology and disease. And so as a result, when the human's not recognized, by definition, their agency is robbed. Their esteem is robbed from them. And people have to clamor to reestablish that in the face of their illness. And that's really hard to do. If you don't have safety, you don't have connection, you're allowed, your dependency is shaped by your illness. And so when people can flip that and be given agency to make decisions about their life and move from their life being defined by their disease versus living with an attendant to their disease, their agency is reclaimed. And you do that with that kind of language.
You talk a lot in your book about suffering actually holding meaning for us, and that it can be a teacher. And that is a hard concept for most of us because we see it. We have this preconceived notion that it's going to be an awful thing, that, again, something that we would want to avoid. But there is an opportunity for it to deepen our lives, to give it more meaning. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about where that transformation comes from?
Sure. It's moving through that. It's that moving through that developmental trajectory, right? I think it's best to kind of talk about the fact that there's a big difference between contentedness and satisfaction. If we talk about suffering as an unmet need, satisfaction is a met need. That does not oftentimes include happiness. Happiness is a fleeting experience, just like any other emotion is fleeting. It comes and goes. It's not a state of continued living. But there's deep satisfaction when you continue to develop. When we are, as humans, we're a dissatisfied species. I mean, our nature.
We're always searching.
We're always looking for the next thing. That is the nature of having a negativity bias and surviving and being a part of a universe that has a developmental, evolving continuum as its underpinning, right? Its energy, it's the way it moves is always constantly evolving. And why would we be any different? So when you look at suffering as a block to flourishing, a block to satisfaction at some point through your developmental trajectory, it gives you some sort of compass or direction, if you will, that removes the feeling of squashedness that comes with being, kind of when you're suffering fear, a lack of safety, or suffering shame, a lack of connection. Those caring for you can help you reestablish those things so you can move through your developmental trajectory. If you've made it through the basic needs and are in becoming needs, you can actually start doing that for yourself when you feel the suffering of, I don't know who I am, I don't know where I'm going. That's the suffering of ignorance. And it points you towards the developmental needs of establishing the sense of self and its capacities, right? And so, suffering, when you say the word, people visibly flinch. They get, it's almost like an onomatopoeia. You say the word suffer and they're all like, and as someone who is committed to helping people suffer well, one of the ways we can undo the unbearable, uncontrollable, unwanted feeling of suffering is to give people a way through it, right? And if we look at it from that more objective developmental viewpoint, you can point to, oh, we have an unmet need of safety. If this person is an unadulterated fear, we know that it's about safety, right? Food, water, shelter, sleep. Can we give them a house, right? Can we just make sure that they feel safe? Can we make sure that they know that they're not alone and that they belong and they don't have to perform or do anything to get those things? Can we help them figure out who they are? Can we make meaning of this with them? And as we move out of that basic need and move more towards these from deficiency into growth, as Maslow talked about, we can help them really explore and actually move through the higher need continuum from dependence to independence to interdependence and transcendence.
Well, and when you think about pure physical pain, and one of the basic understandings of physical pain is that it is a very important and worthy symptom because it calls you to some kind of action. Yep. Even as simple as something like the basic experience of a child touching a hot stove, right, and that pain, that it's an automatic reflexive kind of thing, but it is stimulating a response that moves, that saves you from deeper damage. Right. And if even very simple things like you're sitting at your desk working and your back is hurting or your bottom's getting sore or whatever it is, and your pain or your discomfort is signaling you to make a change. Yeah. And that's a great way to look at that, all of those symptoms that our bodies are giving us that may be in our minds, it may be in our soul, it may just be something deep in our spirit, that something is causing discomfort, which is a call to action.
Call to action. That's all it is. And when we don't listen to that call of action, and it's a call of action that is really key to our development, we will suffer. Period.
What about when we avoid it, when we mask it, when we cover it up,
delay,
when we deny it?
We deny. We perpetuate our suffering and live in a chronic state of dissatisfaction.
And we get stuck.
And we don't develop, which brings us back to that whole conversation about adult development, right? So as a pediatrician, 90% of our general peds curriculum is about promotion of development. All those visits, right? After about the age of 5, we kind of tend to it, but most of the time about the age of 5, there's no pro-social developmental questions. It's all about what's not happening, right? And guiding people through dealing with their behaviors or issues or, kind of pathologies around growth or the lack of puberty or over puberty. We turn into the pathology model of medicine after about the age of 5. And everyone knows that we continue to develop. And to your point, the generational history, historical narrative around being an adult has been, I'm going to have kids, I'm going to be married and be financially independent. Well, none of those have anything to do with psychospiritual development.
Right.
They're outward manifestations. And God knows, I know enough people who've had kids who are married and are financially independent that I would not call developmentally mature. Right. So what would it look like if we were constantly looking at developmental milestones all the way up into the moment and potentially beyond of death? And so suffering points us and gives us the compass, right? Kind of gives us the wayfinding around Maslow's needs. But what does it look like if we meet those needs adequately? What do we do when we are developed appropriately through dependence and independence and interdependence and transcendence? And arguably, the next piece is being able to choose, right? To make a choice around whether or not I want to deny this or move, deny my suffering or move through it.
And to stop saying, why me? And to start saying, what is this showing me?
Where is
this
what is
leading
the
me?
Psychological agility? What tool do I need?
I love that word.
Right? What is the psychological agility that I have that this discomfort, this disquieting, this dissatisfaction, right? This suffering is calling me to attend to.
We often hear the phrase unnecessary suffering. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure what that means compared to necessary suffering is.
Yeah.
Is there a distinction? And why do we use that term unnecessary suffering?
I think it's the infliction of trauma, probably, right? No child should have to suffer at the hands of a caring adult, person. So I think that if in my experiences, it's those violations of social commitments, of the brokenness of connection, particularly the need for connection, someone who's promised to care and they fail in that maliciously or not maliciously, that unnecessary suffering comes into play. I think that's a lot of it. But those children grow up to be adults, and at some point they have to decide, okay, am I going to continue with this unnecessary suffering, right? As a defining moment in my life, or can I do something about it?
So let's talk about suffering in the modern world.
Sure.
In our culture, we're conditioned to avoid discomfort. We've talked about that. We medicate for it. We distract from it. We scroll past it. Mm-hmm. What do you think avoidance is doing to us, not only individually, but collectively, as a community, as a society?
We aren't developing. We're stagnating.
It always comes back to that.
It's all about that. It's all about development, right? We talk about, it was hilarious. One of the Eastern teachers, I think it might be Maharishi, I can't remember exactly, talks about stress, right? So stress has become kind of this trash can diagnosis or experience that we talk about with regards to discomfort, right? So everything's stressed kind of thing. And the way he talked about, he didn't understand stress. And if you actually look at the Dalai Lama's writings and other Eastern teachers that come to the West, they don't understand this concept of stress. And the way he talked about it, it is the resistance to experience. That we are not okay with the full breadth of experience. We only have to have the fun stuff, the easy stuff. And so we resist anything that is difficult. Well,
that sounds like we're manufacturing the stress.
Maybe. Right? That we're not okay with the full breadth of the paradigm of experience. We're not, we are so bombarded by the sensory environment. There's no doubt that our bodies are totally inundated with too much information. Too much. And our bodies are constantly under stress because of the environment that we're in. And so socially, to your point, we have to be careful about what we're willing to attend to within our community and even our smaller community, our family, and then the environment with which we live on a day-to-day basis. You have to attend to what information is coming at you at any given time, because all of a sudden you might find yourself in a state of quote unquote stress, because the sensations, the perceptions, the thoughts, the feelings that come from the inundation of information that are coming in either through the electronic world, or the environmental space that you're in overwhelms people. There's no doubt that that's happening.
That's such a hard divide to manage between being an empathetic human, being compassionate within the world, and yet not taking on the burdens of everything that is going on that we're being constantly educated about on our phones, on our computers, on television, wherever we're getting our information. But that those burdens of stress can weigh us down to a point of suffering that we get stuck because we're just overwhelmed with what's happening today.
Right.
Or during the pandemic, or with multiple subsequent losses. Any of those experiences might create that dynamic within our own lives where we're just inundated and shut down.
And I think one of the things that's really concerning to me is what's real, right? Right now you and I are sitting here and there's the physical touching of you. There's a hard and fast matter to what's happening right now. Right. But then there's a whole other virtual world that we get drawn into at any given time. And what's real and what isn't, I think, is becoming more and more and more difficult to determine because, we've talked about the difference between empathy and compassion. It might be worth us talking a little bit about it, because when we bear witness to someone's suffering, okay, we've determined that whatever event, this pain that we're bearing witness to, this person has articulated that they are suffering as a consequence of it. And as caregivers, we kind of have four primary modalities of responding. Pity is one of them, that this person's suffering is causing me disgust. So,
I don't think most people would phrase pity as disgust.
But that it's an other. It's an, oh, you poor thing, but it creates an otherness. Right. Sympathy is, oh, I see this person's suffering, but I'm overwhelmed and I don't know what to do about it. Right. So there's a sympathy to that. And it's doesn't have a negative.
It's not empowering.
Right. And both of them are othering. Right. Empathy gets really confused with compassion. And I have come to understand empathy as a human tool to recognize someone's suffering and feel the emotional quality of it. But it's meant to tap in and come out of it. It's a call to action to say, can I help this person or not? Can I do something about this person's suffering?
So you wade in, you experience what it probably might feel like, and then you step back and think, now what do I do about it?
Now what do I do about it? And when you when you take action, that moves into compassion. But what happens is some of us have grown up in an environment where we get really skilled at empathy, so much so that we take on and process the emotions in the room as a form of control to keep ourselves safe. Right. Mm-hmm. Which a lot of us in the caring professions have learned to do, that, we've learned to kind of take on and process emotions and control the situation.
We're doing all the work.
We're doing all the work for someone else.
Yeah.
Right. We're taking on the suffering of someone else.
Because then we can solve that.
Right. But that leaves the person underdeveloped. They haven't gone through, instead of compassionately.
They're not really experiencing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And we become emotionally exhausted. And that is empathy fatigue. It's draining. Whereas compassion is a self-renewing energy.
So how do we learn to hold that space without being consumed by it?
Right. How do you learn to remain within you and allow the experience to flow through you versus defending and taking and processing for others?
So all of this conversation is really important in terms of serious illness, chronic illness, terminal illness, but it's not just about sickness within our bodies. All of this same information about suffering, about experiencing and sitting with discomfort and then being called to action, all of that can impact us in our bodily healthy lives as well. Every day. It is something every single one of us can use as a tool for development.
Which brings us back to the beginning of our conversation. This is what death and dying teach us about life and living. And because we don't have death and dying and the care of the dying in community, we have lost the art of living as a consequence. These, kind of death is the ultimate of transpersonal experiences. So transpersonal is the loss of the sense of self, right? So the sense of self moves out of the way. Our filters, our defense mechanisms, all of our identities by which we navigate the world, right? The resistance to experience that we have. The sense of self is a necessary tool that we have. People may call it ego. There's lots of words for it, but the sense of self is a tool by which we navigate the world. And how defended and stuck that sense of self is, because it's the thing that develops and it's ultimately the thing that dies, determines whether or not to what breadth we experience something. And we lose that as we die. And it reveals, if I'm not this sense of self, then what am I? And it calls the question of consciousness and spirit and this whole essence of who we are and all the language around spiritual life. And dying and death and grief are one of those experiences that opens us to exploring that. And, and so it is one of the ultimate teaching spaces for how to suffer well. And so, the more we open our community to those experiences, the more developed the community will be, the more intense living we will be able to do, because we can tolerate and welcome the full breadth of experience versus a very narrow, comfortable experience of living.
And there's so much vibrancy in that.
Oh, totally. I mean, there's this thing in art called the terrible sublime. If you look at any major piece of art, there is this paradox of beauty and suffering all mixed together, right? There's darkness and light. It's the juxtaposition that creates beauty. And so life is a work of art. And the more you're open to the full breadth of that experience, the more vibrancy there is.
Self-actualization is a phrase that many people, you hear it, but
right.
What does that really mean? What does that look like? What does that feel like? And I know for me personally, I'm not fully self-actualized, but in my walk towards that, I know that I define it for myself in this way. And a lot of times people will ask me, why do you do what you do? Why do you do this work? I mean, it's not something that a lot of people can relate to. Why do you do this work? And my answer has always been that when I am sitting at the bedside with someone who is dying and I am helping them navigate that, I'm walking with them on that journey, that I am the best possible expression of myself.
Yeah.
And that, for me, that's the closest thing I can imagine to self-actualization, is how do I become my best self? Yeah. And it's not something that I can do on my own. It's something that happens in community, in context with other people, in spaces that are uncomfortable.
Always. I mean, to your point, I mean, let's just walk you through your developmental stage. You had enough safety and connection growing up, and then ultimately within your own family life, that you could explore who you are and what you could do, right? You know, you explored a lot of the world. You've sailed the world, you've traveled, right? You've explored the world of human condition in your work and those type of things. And that opened you to a really raw human experience, which is the need for intimacy, right? So you have the need for safety, need for connection, need for esteem, need for exploration, which leads to this need for intimacy. And, you know, most of the time in Western world, we talk about intimacy within the context of sex, and that's not what I'm talking about. Sex is one expression of that, but intimacy is being able to fully know and fully feel another, and to also be known and fully felt by another. Mm-hmm. That can be one-on-one, that can be one-on-one in a patient dynamic, can be a spousal dynamic, child dynamic, friend dynamic, right? So we have those one-on-one intimate connections, but we also have the intimate connection with the beyond and with a community and with an idea for those who do creative life. So it's the profound vulnerability that comes with wanting to know oneself in the context of a much greater picture. And that's what you're talking about, right? And when you open yourself to that need for intimacy and the satisfaction of compassion that comes with that, right? Purpose naturally reveals itself. Everyone has their purpose within them. You don't have to go find it. It has to be revealed through appropriate development, and through purpose, self-actualization occurs. Right? Because the sense of self is then fully defined so that it can be transcended, which is the last stage of human development.
For those listeners who are in pain in whatever way it may come to them, or they're walking alongside someone who is, where can they start? Give us one truth or one practice where people can start to explore this in a way that will lead to growth.
Yeah. So for the person who is in pain and aware and curious enough to be listening to this, I would ask yourself, do you feel safe? What would make you feel safe right now in this moment? Assure your basic needs are met. Food, water, shelter, sleep, and connection. We're so disconnected at this point. And so many people's pain is an expression of loneliness, right? So the biggest thing you can take right now is a deep breath. Your body and your breath are the number one way to bring you into this moment, right? Take you out of the past, take you out of the future, and bring you into the present moment here. So we talk about, you know, there's a lot of meditation and prayer practices about being now, right? Being in the now. Well, I also argue you have to be here too. And what happens is we live outside of our bodies. We don't live in our bodies. We live in one part of our bodies because it's more comfortable than others. And when we're in pain, we tend to isolate the pain, and we don't fully inhabit our body as a result of it. So not only do you need to bring the mind now into the present moment, but we also have to bring it here with the breath. Bring yourself fully into your body. What is this pain calling you to attend to, right? What is the call to action? Is it a basic need for safety? I'm hungry. I'm tired. You know, I may need some basic pain medication, right? Attending to the body, right? And start there. Start with basic needs. Basic needs. So many people are walking around looking for purpose when their basic needs aren't met.
Mm-hmm. And that's why we fail so often, because we got to build a foundation.
It's a house of cards.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Basic needs. When in doubt, food, water, shelter, sleep, and a good hug. I mean,
it's a great place to start. It's a great place to start. And that is essential. That's just essential about being alive and being human.
Yeah. I mean, so many people are that's what the pandemic revealed, is so many people are walking around with their basic needs just kind of blah, 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 on their forehead. I'm not safe. I'm so disconnected, right? And we have not fully healed from that because we have this hidden curriculum as part of our society. I mean, I talked about the hidden curriculum of medicine, but it's based in the hidden curriculum of our society that you must do it and you must do it alone. And there's nothing more antithetical to the human experience and the human species, that we are social creatures. We need each other. You can't develop without another human. I mean, that's why
we're not wired.
We're not wired that way. We're dependent longer than any other species on the planet for a reason.
We could talk for hours. We could do this again, and hopefully we will, and keep going, but we are going to have to draw this to a close. I want to thank you for helping us look at suffering in a new way, not something to fear, something to probe, to understand, to open up and honor. Just thank you. Thank you for sharing all that. You say, with your book, you say, suffer well. I'm finally beginning to understand that.
Yeah.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us in the deep end. If this conversation resonated with you, I encourage you to read Dr. Clark's book, Suffer, and to keep exploring what it means to live fully, tenderly, and awake. Anything you want to close
thank
with?
you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for being my friend.
Oh, I love being your friend. Well, I'm Kelley Scott, sitting with Jennifer Clark, and this has been The Deep End. Until next time, take care of yourself, be gentle with the world and with your own heart.